It's week 5, and we're looking at the early church, the earliest Christian community. And first of all, I apologize for the way I sound. I feel better than I sound, but I've had a cold over the weekend. Been out for a little bit, and my voice hasn't recovered yet. But what I wanted to do is just give a brief overview of a couple of the resources that we're looking at for this week. We're looking at the early chapters of the book of Acts to get a sense, to get some insight and perspective on what the earliest Christian communities looked like. One of the fascinating things we can do, even though our course has focused on the life of Jesus mostly from Matthew's gospel, and we've made some comparisons to Mark and to Luke as well. But if we transition for a moment to think about Luke and Acts as two volumes of the same project, and think that the author Luke was writing first the Acts of Jesus through the Holy Spirit, and that's what we call the gospel. And then secondly, he wrote the Acts of Jesus through his apostles by the Holy Spirit, and that's often called the Acts of the Apostles. And it's really helpful, I think, to read Luke's gospel and the book of Acts as parts 1 and part 2 of the same story. In fact, I think it's even more helpful to think about the Old Testament story of Israel as God's people, and then the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus lives out and embodies what true Israel looks like, and then to see the book of Acts as almost part 3 in that trajectory, where the early Christian communities take on the characteristics and the traits of the Jesus that Luke and Matthew and Mark describe, and they begin to live out what it looks like to take Jesus' announcement of the kingdom and apply that practically to the way human beings can live in this world in community. And so the early chapters of the book of Acts kind of take us through that account from Luke's perspective. What I wanted to do then is just to give a brief overview, a couple of the main points from the two textbooks that you'll do some readings from. And you can see all the readings here listed in the Moodle section for week 5. But let me start with a couple of observations from the Fee and Stewart text. And they first observe that reading the book of Acts should be just the same way you would read Old Testament narrative, some of the stories and accounts in the Old Testament. But Christians, many contemporary Christians, we somehow shift gears almost instinctively when we get to the book of Acts, and we assume that because these are accounts of the earliest Christians, and because we identify as Christians very often as readers, we assume that exactly what happened in the book of Acts should also happen in our lives or in the context of the church community that we're a part of. And Fee and Stewart kind of warn against that. I mean, they certainly don't deny that the Holy Spirit was doing some amazing things in these Christian communities, and that they can inspire us to also live out the shalom of Jesus' kingdom in our own setting. But sometimes what happens with Christians reading this, they almost read it as a blueprint or as a manual that every church has to do exactly what the Christians in the book of Acts did. We think it's probably better that we read the book of Acts as telling a story and then giving us some inspiring examples of how that story carries forward. So the main story that Fee and Stewart tell us, Luke is trying to tell in the book of Acts, is the story of how the gospel moves geographically from Jerusalem in the east to Rome at the center of the Mediterranean world, the city of power, the main city of the empire. And it's basically the successful movement of the gospel across the entire Mediterranean world. And what Luke is telling us is that the gospel was successful in the most hostile circumstances possible, in the middle of the Roman Empire. Along the way, we get lots of different accounts and examples of how Christian communities lived out their faithfulness to Jesus and continued the example of Jesus. And so they do inspire us. But for us to think that we have to live exactly that same way is probably something that's not repeatable. And so what we're best to do is ask the question, what would Acts chapter 29 or 30? Because there are only 28 chapters, right? But if the book of Acts were written today, what would it look like for us as followers of Jesus, as Christian communities, to live out the message that Jesus announced, which we looked at for the first 4 weeks of this course? So that's why it was written. And then Fee and Stewart give us some good tips or pointers on how best to read the book of Acts to make sure that we don't mistake what's narrated for what's normative. In other words, that it has to happen exactly the way we read it in the book of Acts. And they try to encourage us to differentiate between what's just incidental details to the story Luke tells versus the intentional points or principles that he wants us as readers to catch. And then they want us to differentiate between what are simply illustrations and what might actually be repeatable patterns. So those are some important things to keep in mind, and they go into much more detail in chapter 6 of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And then in chapters 11 and 12 of the Craybill text, which you're also reading for this week, Craybill makes some really good observations about what it looks like for societies to be constructed around power, and how that most of our social expectations are that we gain or grasp as much power as possible. But the way of Jesus asks, how can we give power away? How can we serve? How can we move down the social ladder instead of climbing up the social or corporate ladder? And so Craybill asks us to think about social status and power, and that Jesus' authority came from serving. And you might want to ask the question, as you read the first 15 chapters of the book of Acts, in what ways did the early church successfully mirror that example of Jesus? And are there a couple of examples where they don't do that successfully? Because the book of Acts is as much about how early Christians get it wrong, and God is still able to accomplish what he wants to do in spite of that. And then you might want to just ask the question, what similarities do you see between the churches in the book of Acts and the life of Jesus? How were these Christian communities able to create what we might call a new society or an alternative society to the one, the Roman one, even the Jewish religious one that was so shaped around human standards and expectations of power? And finally, Craybill asks us to think about what are the habits of genuine, flourishing kingdom communities? What does it look like for people to join and gather around the example of Jesus and find practical, tangible ways to live that out in everyday life? So as you make those observations in the book of Acts, you can be thinking to the church community that you've either visited as a project for this course, maybe the one you grew up in, or the one you participate in now if you do. And then maybe you want to even bring that closer to home and say, so in what ways do I participate in this kingdom life that Jesus modeled and described and announced, and that the earliest Christians in the book of Acts tried to take seriously as well? And if you want, as a reminder then, once you've read through the first 15 chapters of the book of Acts, go back and just read the last few verses of Acts chapter 2 again, especially verses 42 to 47. Those are classic examples of the kind of community the earliest Christians sought to forge. There was generosity, there was care, there was prayer, there was encouragement, and there was a bearing of burdens. They assumed that some of them would be suffering and others could help. Those are all great places to start, and I look forward to reading your assignments. As you read the book of Acts, do the readings, and also interact with the church communities that you've been interviewing and doing some of the project work for, and look forward to hearing all that you have to say and interact with for week 5. Have a great week.